Good morning, all. Glad to have you back for our second Sunday with David K. Johnston. We're talking this week about the tax system. And I've sent out 2 weeks ago about more about David's biography. But it's interesting to me that he's taken many college courses, but he has no letters to go after his name because he skipped over the prerequisites. And if you don't have the basic courses, you don't get the degree. But you've heard him before, you know that he's extremely well educated, a lot of it done on his own, as well as through courses. And he's taught many courses at a number of locations. And this year he's off and running at RIT. And I'll let you get off and running on this. And
well, good morning. Nice to see you. And what a nice day with nice colors. So last week we talked about spending, what that says about us. So this time I want to talk about the revenue side. This is backwards the way it's usually done, but sometimes it's good to look at things the other way around. So if you go to the first slide. Oops. There we go. This is from 1986 from the Catholic bishops. There was a Presbyterian group which hired me as a consultant on income inequality. The stated clerk has copies of this that you can read about the Presbyterian Justice Group's examination of equity in our tax system. But there are two parts of this, and I want you to pay a particular part here to the second statement I quote from the National Council of Catholic Bishops. A system of taxation based on assessment according to ability to pay is a prime necessity to meet our social obligations to the poor. Now, that is not a new idea. I used to do a lot of right-wing radio before they switched and stopped having people like me on. And people would all the time say, oh, you're a Marxist. You believe in progressive taxes. And I'd say, well, actually, Karl Marx was in round numbers about 2,500 years late to that idea by one measure and 4,000 years by another. They go, what? And I go, the Bible is a progressive taxation. No, it's not. It's a 10% tithe. And I said, no, I'm afraid that you're wrong. Go study your Bible. So let's go to the next. Yep, no problem, David. There's a 1 up there on the screen. I hear you guys are getting a new computer. That'll be a good thing. Can't do 2 things at one time. It's Jerry Ford, chewing gum and walking. Okay, this is a chart I showed you last week. If you hit forward, it's animated too. This is gross domestic product is now actually $1 trillion higher than that. This is from 2023. Next one. All the spending without duplicating, because the federal government gives a lot of money to the states and local governments, and states give money to local governments. So this is backing out the double counting. And the last one, it's 36% of our economy, a little more than a third. This is very low compared to Western Europe. So next screen. You shall tithe the entire crop of your planting, the produce of the field year by year. That's an income tax. That's not a head tax. The temple tax in the Old Testament was a head tax. Everybody paid the same tax. This is an income tax. Okay, next, David, please. And the agricultural tax was progressive. Professor Adam Chodorow at the Sandra Day O'Connor Law School in Phoenix has done a great deal of writing about the Bible and tax systems, as has Professor Susan Hamill at the University of Alabama, who also has a divinity degree. And both of them have shown in numerous papers and a couple of books in her case that America's tax system is at odds with biblical directions, even though you have all sorts of people saying this was a Judeo-Christian nation. Never mind that it's not. If you're going to make that argument, you at least ought to know what's in your Bible. Next. So, Old Testament tax rates. Professor Chodorow shows that the I always say, you get this wrong, Messick-Kafer tax, the agricultural tax, the rates were as high as 22%. And the rabbis had the same kind of tax discussions tax lawyers do now, which I've characterized as how many special tax cuts can dance on the head of a pin. For example, you have an olive tree, and a large part of the branch crosses the border into the next country. Are you taxed on that part of the fruit of your tree? Because after all, it's not in Israel. It is across the border. And of course, there were people whose farm was right on the border. And there are extensive rabbinical discussions of these issues about taxes. So as high as 22%, and gleaning, we all know what gleaning is. So we had a negative tax rate. Sort of, if you think about it, not unlike the earned income tax credit, which you only get if you work. And then only if you make it's a minimum of, I think, about $8,000 or $9,000 a year. So next. So the birth of Western democracy in ancient Greece, and it wasn't all of Greece. Greece was a bunch of little city-states. This was Attica, what we call modern-day Athens. Democracy was the civil twin of progressive taxation. When the Athenians started talking about this radical idea that we will rule ourselves instead of a tyrant, and in that era, tyrant did not mean what it means today. You know, words change their meaning all the time. Meritocracy started out as a pejorative. McCarthyism started out as a term of praise. And both of those, of course, now mean the opposite. So the issue arose, if you're going to have a democracy, how are you going to pay for it? And after all, the rich have always said, well, we have most of the money. We're the ones who really pay for government, so we should run things. And what the Athenians came up with was a very simple principle. If you lived in Athens, a civilized society, a society that had police and courts to protect your fortunes. And by the way, the way people kept their fortunes was literally piles of gold or silver or other valuables in their basement. The wealthiest family in Athens had, in today's money, somewhere in the neighborhood of $150 to $250 million. So they came up with the idea that the greater your benefit, your economic gain from living in Athens, the greater the tax you should pay. You should pay it back to the society that made you wealthy possible. Because countries are not about you or me. They are about the whole of the society and perpetuating that society. And among the places in the what we call the civilized world, Athens was paradise 2,500 years ago. It was an incredible place to live. And if you didn't pay your taxes, they took you to the city gate and threw you out, which for many people was effectively a death sentence. So there was an incentive to pay your taxes that was quite strong. They also developed a system by which they honored the largest taxpayers. So whenever there would be a festival, and in ancient Athens, they had festivals all the time, just like in the medieval era, the peasants had, dozens of festivals during the year. We get a little sampling of that with our summer, corn and Park Avenue and clothesline festivals. And the government would go to what they believed was the wealthiest person in town who had not paid for a festival, or for something in the military. For example, a trireme, those large ships that were moved with oars and had a very powerful bow so that they could, at the water level, disable another ship by filling it with water. They didn't want it to sink because they want the ship. but fill it with water and then it can't be used in warfare. So they would go to you and they'd say, well, Dick Schwartz, you're the next person on the list. We want $1 million. And you'd say, no, I'm not the richest person on the list. Then Bob Carlyle is richer than I am. Go hit up Bob. And Bob then had a choice to make. A system was called Antidosis. This is a prototype of audit. Prototype, we build one model of a car, an airplane to see what it would be like. It's the prototype. And this prototype audit, Bob would have to evaluate, well, am I richer than Schwartz or is he richer than me? And you could offer to switch fortunes with him, which is one of the early elements in developing state intelligence apparatuses and private intelligence networks. In fact, the ancient Egyptians, the ancient Romans practiced what's called tax farming. So they would go to somebody, and David here would be among the bidders to collect Rome's taxes in Rochester. And you had to pay the government up front. And then if you collected the taxes, they were yours to keep. Anything you collected above what you had to pay the government, which nobody knew what it was, you got to keep. And the only fundamental rule was, hey, I'm the emperor. I don't want any effort to overthrow me or get rid of me. And if you squeeze too hard, I just kill you. It's a real simple enforcement mechanism. So you're going to not squeeze people so much that they revolt, but you're going to collect all the taxes because I've already gotten them up front. Kind of unlike withholding, where you don't get paid till the government gets the taxes. So the Greeks came up with this idea of progressive taxation. The greater your gain because you have the privilege of living in Athens, the greater you must pay back to Athens. So next. So this is I want to show you how we've changed federal tax collections. This comes from the Office of Management and Budget. And I've been analyzing these tables for, 50 years. And I picked 1954 just because it's 70 years ago. And the 2024 fiscal year just ended, September 30th. We're now in the fiscal year 2025. So back in 54, 42% of the federal government's revenue came from individual income taxes. It's gone up to 49%. That's an increase of a sixth. But look at the corporate tax. It's fallen from 30% to 12.1. That's a 60% decline in the burden of the corporate income tax. Medicare only had Social Security back then. Medicare was added in 1965. It's tripled. It's more than tripled. And of course, when you have your Medicare and Social Security tax paid and your employer pays, and by the way, the employer side, the companies got us all to call it a contribution. It's just wages you don't see that are taxed at a rate of 100%. So if your salary is $100,000 and your employer looks at it, your salary is actually $107,650. And that last $7,650 is just taxed away at 100% rate. And then we have excise taxes. If you have to put new tires on your car, you'll notice there's an excise tax on it. There are a number of things we tax like that. Excise taxes have similarly collapsed to almost nothing. Excise taxes generally are not a good thing unless you're trying to discourage the use of something. If you want to seriously discourage cars, triple the excise tax on tires, and that will probably help encourage people not to drive so much or to buy better quality tires and keep their cars in line. So this composition has changed enormously. The burden of taxes has been shifted off companies onto individuals. Now, it's widely reported in the US in the news that companies just pass the taxes on to their customers. Well, anybody who took just Economics 101 should know that cannot be true in a competitive economy. If we have competitive market capitalism, you can't do that. If you're a monopolist, and we have lots of monopolies in America, yeah, you can just pass the cost of the tax on, and you can raise taxes even if the market goes down. There's a recession, you can raise taxes. Raise prices because you're a monopoly or a duopoly or a triopoly in the case of the cell telephone companies. The incidence of this tax, who actually bears the burden, is the subject of a lot of debate. It could be borne by the customers through higher prices. It could be borne by the shareholders through lower rates of return on the business. That is, they decide, well, we'd rather keep our market share, so we're going to absorb some or all of the corporate income tax and reduce our returns. It can be borne by vendors. You know, every large manufacturing company has thousands and thousands of vendors. There's millions of parts in a new, for example, Boeing jetliner made by thousands, tens of thousands of different manufacturers all over the world. And it can be borne by the workers. And lo and behold, if workers don't have unions anymore, or their unions are weakened, as we've seen happen in the last almost 50 years, it's much easier for a company to just press down on the wages of workers and have them bear the burden of the corporate income tax. And there's a lot of evidence that that's exactly what's going on. But we've had an absolute definite shift away from taxing corporations to taxing individuals. So next, David. This is a map at the state level from a group called ITEP, the Institute for Taxation and Economic Policy. They have been doing studies for years. They're always reliable. And what this map shows you is which states have regressive or relatively progressive tax systems. So New York State, we're not regressive. Florida is the most regressive system in the country. They don't have an income tax, and Florida is full of people worth millions and billions of dollars. Texas is in the bottom of that line. Surprisingly, Illinois is in it. Regressive means the lower you are on the ladder, the more tax you pay as a share of your income. Progressive, the more you make, the greater your burden of tax. And you measure these in percentages of your income or assets or whatever's being taxed, not absolute dollars. So if you have if you're Larry Ellison of Oracle or Michael Bloomberg, each of whom has an annual income north of $5 billion, and you paid only 1% of your income, and I pay, as my wife and I did last year, 24% of our income to the federal government. The dollars we paid are nothing compared to him at 1%, but we're much more heavily burdened than he is. We're 24 times more heavily burdened. And then when you add the concept of what's called the marginal utility of additional money, if you work all year and make $10,000, and the evening of December 31st, you have a choice of riding the bus home or buying something for $1 to eat, that's a real tough choice. If you make $5 billion a year, it's meaningless. It's absolutely meaningless. And in fact, we've had wealthy couples in America, at least one I've written about, the Adelsons, who had his and her personal 747s. And Mrs. Adelson, hers was outfitted to allow her youngest grandchildren to ride skateboards in the sky. And the pilot would do things like this in the air for the kids. So I want to go to the next slide, if you would. In 41 of these states, high-income families are taxed at lower rates than everyone else. And high income in this case means the highest 1%. People in the top 1% have lower rates than everybody below them. Next. In most states, in fact, the top 1% pay the lowest rates for state and local taxes. Now think about that. Of course they do. We pay in Monroe County an 8.25% sales tax. If you have a $5 billion income, how many things are you going to buy that the sales tax applies to? Hardly anything relative to your income. You can't spend that kind of money. I used to get on planes, and because I flew so much, I got first class all the time. And I would get out a notebook and I would cajole the person next to me, usually a business executive or a business owner, into playing a game that I didn't tell them. We called it Home Wretched Excess. The game was, how much money can you spend on consumption for your lifestyle? And most people would start out and I'd say the rules are you got to work 50 hours a week, you get 2 weeks vacation. And most people would say, well, I'm going to buy a bunch of oil paintings. I go, nope, that's not consumption. That's just converting dollar bills into a new asset called art. And the art may go up in value, it may go down in value, but that's not consuming. You want to buy a Coca-Cola, that's consuming. Very few people could spend more than $400,000. I had a couple of people who were able to spend $800,000. The first time I did this with my graduate business students at Syracuse, one of the young men stepped up first and said, I'm going to buy all the beer I want. So I went to the blackboard and said, how much does a 6-pack of beer cost? How much can you drink and still be able to go to class? Because you're going to spend 50 hours a week. And then somebody said, well, all right, beer is cheap. I'm going to take 4 friends every night to Le Cirque for dinner. And I looked around the room. I said, how many of you here have been to dinner at Le Cirque? Ah, nobody. Well, you probably all will someday in the future. Let me just tell you, be ready for a 3 to 5 hour dinner. That's how it works. And we figured out how much you could spend on dinner, including, I gave them credit for $10,000 bottles of wine. Several. And then I pointed out that you have to work 50 hours a week. So after consuming 3,000 calories at this very fancy French restaurant, you're going to get up and go to work the next morning? You know, you really haven't thought this through. And by the way, a year from now, when your blood sugar reading is 11 on a 90-day basis and you're in the hospital and they're about to cut one of your legs off, and the person who surprisingly was the most successful, the only person who ever figured out how to spend more than $2 million was my skinflint wife. When she ran the community foundation, we had a huge fight early on because she went to give a talk somewhere. And when she left the talk, she snagged her pantyhose. So she walked into the old mall we had downtown, the second enclosed mall in the country. And she bought pantyhose. And she said, well, no, she can't put in for the $2 parking because that's personal. And we really do it over that. She figured out how to spend about $5 million a year. And I said, well, she said, well, listen, I'm going to have, we got 2 little girls. Let's have 4 nannies so we were covered at all times. I'm going to have a chauffeur. Actually, because of the children, I'm going to have a chauffeur on call sitting out in the driveway 24 hours a day and a second chauffeur to take the children to school and to run them to any errands. And she said, and then I want a corporate jet. I said, no, you can't buy a jet, even though it's a depreciating item, that's an asset. She's, no, I'm not going to buy a jet. I'm going to lease one. And I went, okay. And I went and priced out leasing a Gulfstream G5 ready on 6 hours notice and for the year. And it came in at about $2 million to be used the level she thought it would be. And then she said, now, little lesson I learned from your friend Molly Ringwald, I'm going to only wear haute couture business suits. And I went, sweetheart, you don't have the time to stand there and be fitted for them. It takes hours. And she goes, oh, no. I'm going to hire a woman with my figure and you don't get to see her naked. And we agreed we'd pay her $60,000 a year. This was 20 years ago or so, and a couple of dresses. She was able to spend $5 million on consumption, but it's really hard. Oh, part of that was she was going to spend about $400,000 a year having fresh flowers constantly delivered. Elton John does that. So the marginal utility of $1 is very important when we think about this. Some people don't have enough, and some people have more than they can possibly consume, unless they gamble. That is the one way you could run your fortune to the ground. Or you invest badly in Hollywood movies. Both guaranteed ways to if you're a billionaire who wants to be a millionaire, both of those will work. All right, next one. This is the most troubling. In 46 states, the top 1% are taxed less than the middle 60%. So economists divide people typically into quintiles, 20% sections. So the poor are the bottom 20%. The affluent and the rich are up here in the top 20. In the middle 60, that's the middle class, at least in general theory for analysis. 46 of the 50 states, the top 1%, are taxed at a lower rate than the middle 60%. This is not a progressive system. It is not a system consistent with religious values. And those religious values, by the way, to the extent that I've been able to find records by studying the writings of imams, especially from the 9th century, from the Hindu religion. There's 6,000 religions in India. I've just focused on the one. You will see the same belief and pattern all the way back to the ancient world. And I used to teach the law of the ancient world. Progressive taxation is not some newfangled idea. It's thousands of years old. Okay. Next. Good, we're through. So our tax system violates all the fundamental, long-established principles of taxation. One of those principles is convenience of paying. You should be easily able to pay your tax. I don't know about you, but I do our own tax returns, 84 pages this year. 84 pages when we put everything together. That's ridiculous. I did the tax returns for one of my children who's only a salaried worker and didn't make very much money. And everything printed out for them still came to 30 pages. And you get asked these questions about, well, did the money come from here or there, or how did you use it? We have this incredible, Rube Goldberg could not have invented something as complicated as the tax system, where you start here and then end up with, here's how much money you have to turn over at the bottom. Secondly is certainty of what the tax will be. You should know, if I make X dollars or I buy a house at X value, here's what the tax will be. It shouldn't be capricious. You should be able to rely on a set of rules, objective rules, that will allow you to know this. Now, every country doesn't operate like this. If I had become a foreign correspondent in Japan for either the LA Times or the New York Times, because they had bureaus there, there's a person in the bureau, a fixer. All foreign bureaus of news organizations have fixers. And he would have gone to see the local prefect tax person. Prefect is a political jurisdiction like a state, a county, an oblast, a province. And would tell me, you don't say a word until I tell you to say yes or no. And that's all you're ever going to say. And he would negotiate the taxes I would pay on my income. It's not an objective measure. It's not, you made this much money, you pay this much tax. You negotiate them. They do the same thing in the cantons of Switzerland and some other places around the world, as a system, of course, ripe for corruption with the tax collectors. Now, another principle is horizontal equity. You can measure things vertically and horizontally. So we've talked about vertical. The greater your income, the larger the share you should pay back, because you had the privilege of living in the society that made your wealth or income possible. But horizontal equity is, here's somebody who has a married couple, 3 children, lives in a $400,000 house, and one of them works. Here's another couple, $400,000 house, 3 kids. The $400,000 is salaried to both of them. So that means they pay more Social Security tax, because Social Security tax stops at about $170,000. But if there's 2 of you, it stops at $340,000. And one couple bought their home, met the new stringent rules on deducting their mortgage interest, and is able to take advantage of the $10,000 limit on state and local tax deductions at the federal government. And the other family organized their finances differently. They rent the house that they're in, so they get no benefit of any kind. You can have people with the same income who pay radically different taxes. So there is no horizontal equity anymore because of all of the things we've done to our tax system. Finally, we end up with a system in which nobody in this room, unless I'm badly mistaken, can do what I'm about to describe. But there are hundreds of thousands of Americans who can't. Think for a moment about how much money you're going to spend this year. Now multiply that by 100 and double it. If you have that much money, where you're spending 0.5% of your wealth each year, you don't have to ever pay taxes again. Because what you do is you invest in non-dividend paying stocks, or bonds that are tax-free, and you borrow against your assets. You borrow against your assets. You say, well, I need $10 million this year. I'm worth $10 billion. It's bupkis. It's not even a penny. It's on the dollar. And at the end of the year, you owe 2% interest or 3%. I'll make it 3%. So now you owe $10,300,000. But if you'd taken the $10 million and paid taxes on it, you would have only had about $7 million, maybe $6 if at that tax bracket. So you would have had to take out more than, to have the $10 million to spend, you would have had to take out $15 million to pay the taxes. In fact, closer to $17 million to pay the taxes and net 10. But instead, you had a $300,000 interest charge instead of a multi-million-dollar tax bill. So you get to the end of the year. Oh, well, you just roll that debt forward and you take a new loan out. Now you got another $10 million. And at the end of the year, you'll have $20 million of debt, $300,000 of interest that's compounded. And now you're up to owing about $20,700,000 instead of having paid at that point about $6 to $8 million in taxes. Why would you ever do anything but borrow from yourself if you have that kind of wealth? And Congress allows this. Congress doesn't have to allow this. Congress could deem that borrowing against your assets above a certain level is income. It's just disguised income. But here's where it gets even better. You've borrowed all this money from against your assets, and then you die. Because unfortunately, we're all going to die. And what happens at that point? Well, you get to deduct debts from your estate. And so it lowers your estate. And then Congress says you can give all your money away when you die and never pay on the gains in your account. Never pay any taxes on the gains in your account. So the government is completely cut out from revenue from your financial success. Whereas if you're a wage earner, no, the government gets its cut before you get your money. It comes out in front. This system that allows people to borrow against their assets without limit and to give away unlimited amounts when they die is a major and growing force in why people at the very top are so well off. I've, under a non-disclosure agreement, gone through Warren Buffett's tax returns. And I can't tell you any details, but I'll tell you this. Warren Buffett, and I predicted Warren Buffett's tax rate for his income publicly about 25 years ago. I said he probably pays 17.2%. And Larry Kudlow, who was the chief economic advisor to Donald Trump and has a show on CNBC, Warren Buffett announced one year that he paid 17.1%, and Larry Kudlow said, David Johnston got it wrong. Spoke with Larry about that in the hallway of one of the TV studios in New York. He said, but you were wrong. But here's the amazing part of it. Buffett's income, Buffett is worth over $100 billion. His income is a fraction of 1% of his wealth. The only income he has is when some business that he's an investor in is sold for cash, and he has no option but to take that money as income. Berkshire Hathaway, his company that holds 99% of his wealth, Berkshire Hathaway doesn't pay dividends. If you want to buy a share, the last time I looked, it was about $250,000 a share, by the way. If you'd been smart when his stock was down in 93, you could have bought for $4,400. But the system means that someone like Warren Buffett with billions of dollars, well, yeah, he's publicly indicated he pays a few tens of millions of dollars a year in taxes. It's nothing against his wealth. And he's giving it away. And when he dies, he'll give it all away. And the government will never get any money from this fortune that he's built. At the same time, you're going to be taxed. If you're a married couple over 65, you get about $30,000 of income that isn't taxed by the federal government. And then you're taxed at 10%, 12%, 22% is the next category, 24%, 32%, 35%, 37%. To pay at that top level, you got to make close to $1 million a year before deductions. But there are hundreds of thousands of families, more than 1/3 of a million families, who report an annual income north of $1 million a year. And by the way, among people who make over $10 million a year, I calculate this every year, about 1 in 300 don't pay any federal income tax, despite that income. Because typically, I would expect, if I could get the data, they are in real estate. And if you are a full-time, which means, by the way, 15 hours a week, a full-time real estate professional who manages your properties, like Donald Trump, who qualifies. It's not that hard to qualify for 15 hours a week. You're allowed to take unlimited losses from your real estate against your other income. And as one of the most prominent New York City tax lawyers said to me one day when I was at the New York Times, listen, it's very simple. If you're seriously into real estate and you're paying any federal income tax, you should sue your lawyer for malpractice. And, well, what happens when the tax shelter on building A runs out? Well, that's why you buy building B and C and D. So we have a tax system that has become so complicated that seriously, Rube Goldberg could not have designed something as complicated and difficult as we have. And my next book, which has been in delay for a long time, first because I had to finish it, but then because I'm now trying to write it at a level that 10th graders people with a 10th grade education will understand. More than half of Americans read at 6th grade level or below. More than 1 in 5 read at 3rd grade level or below. And I want to at least get people with a high school education to understand this book. There will be no or virtually no numbers in the first half of the book, because all the research from the ebooks shows that the minute a number appears, readers start dropping off. Even the simplest number, prices went up 20%. They're no more, because when you read an ebook, they keep anonymous records on what page you're on, and what you've highlighted. And so in this proposal, here's what I do. All income is treated the same. A dollar is a dollar is a dollar. Under our current system, New York State bonds, tax-free. Capital gains from a business, no tax if you make less than, I think it's a married couple, about $80,000. And the highest tax rate you can pay is 20% plus the new Medicare surcharge, so 24% in round numbers. Whereas on the same income, you could pay 37%. I propose to do one of two things with the corporate income tax, and this is the most difficult issue in the book. We could eliminate the corporate income tax. We could make dividends a tax-deductible expense to companies. That's another option. Or we could raise the corporate income tax to 60%. All of them will have the same fundamental effect. The reason we allow corporations, which have been enormously important to creating wealth, to holding and managing wealth, is that they're there to benefit society. In the early days of the American Republic, if you wanted to have a corporation, you had to show it had a social benefit. Well, how are we going to be better off for letting you have your corporation? Instead of just being the Village Blacksmith, you want to be Village Blacksmith, Inc. Okay, we'll shield you from some kinds of litigation. That's what a corporation is known as, an entity shield. But what benefit? And if you said, well, I'm going to create 5 jobs, they go, no. You create jobs because you need them. That has nothing to do with it. Think about that the next time you see that Comida, our giveaway operation at the county level, says, oh, this company's going to create 175 jobs, so we're going to give them $5 million of tax breaks. No, that's not how it should work. You also could only be in business to do one thing. You wanted to do 4 things, you had to have 4 businesses, and your business license was limited, your charter, to 20 years, typically. 20 years. Then you had to go back and get a new one. Today, for about $40, you can go to the state of New York, create a corporation, pay $9 a year to maintain it. It's now called a shelf company. I own 2 of them. If I wanted to do something, I just pull them off the shelf and act through the business. Meantime, they just sit there. And it's not unusual for individuals to own as many as 6,000 businesses. The Pritzker family, whose finances became significantly into the public realm because they owned casinos, in the late 70s, had more than 2,500 family trusts. And the way the family trusts were constructed, you had nothing, even if you were one of the Pritzkers. As long as you got along with the family, you were rich. You wanted to fight with the family, you discover that your share of the trust of the trust of the trust of the trust of the major trust of this trust over here to the obligated to that trust left you with $100 to cash out. And there were some people who fought the family and discovered, how they suddenly became poor. To the tax system, though, it was all measured as the poor system. Or as I like to describe it, the American tax code for the wealthy is based on the principle that families that get along don't pay taxes, and families that don't get along pay a lot of taxes. Totally inappropriate. So my system will tax all dollars the same. And if you tax a corporation at 60%, I will tell you what happens. If dividends are tax deductible, profits will be paid out as dividends. Profits beyond what they want to pay out as dividends will be reinvested in the business. I mean, imagine you own a business and your finance person comes into your office the day before Christmas and says, we're going to make $10 million more profit than we thought this year. There was a mistake in the accounting records and we're going to owe a lot of taxes. Well, if there's a 60% tax system, what you're going to do is say, fine, arrange right now to pay X amount in dividends. Go buy a whole bunch of stuff that we need that's expensible so we can deduct it immediately, and sign contracts for anything beyond that. We've been talking about fixing up production line 3. So go, call up the contractor and sign a contract with them today and pay them, $1 million on the job so we can detect it this year. That's what you're going to do. If there's no corporate income tax, then there's no issue about your income from the corporation. The justification for a lower tax rate on dividends and capital gains is double taxation. Well, the company was taxed and now you're being taxed. That the company may not pay any income taxes is irrelevant. It's that in theory, it's double taxed. Under my system, if you have your own business, as I've had for 50 years, writing books and articles and stuff, I get a check for book royalties or an advance or a magazine article or a lecture. I just put it in the bank account and spend it. And at the end of the year, I settle up with the company, with the government. Under my system, no, you couldn't do that anymore. Instead, the money would go into a bank account of mine. And if I want to withdraw it, the trustee on my account will withdraw the taxes. So if I say, well, I want $10,000 net, he'd calculate the taxes and send me $10,000 and hand the rest to the government. This is exactly what wage earners do. And every employer in America has an individual. RIT has an individual. Kodak has an individual who is personally liable if the taxes are not withheld and if they are not turned over. And according to the IRS, under that system, 99.97% of money that is withheld is properly handled. And by the way, assume the finance guy at the company tries to run off to Costa Rica, where we don't have an extradition treaty, with all the tax money. You're still credited with having paid because you didn't get the money. It was withheld from your paycheck. So the government treats this as you paid it. Well, why should Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos be on a different system? Why is it that we're not trusted by Congress and have to have taxes taken out before we get them? But they get to tell the government at the end of the year, here's what the tax we think should be. And if you're not audited under our system and you cheated tremendously, the government didn't audit you, your tax return is accepted as filed. And there are people who cheat all the time. Among people who make over $10 million a year, you know how many tax returns were audited in 2022? 50,000 of these people. 80. But yeah, nothing. Absolute bupkis number. 80. And many times, very, very wealthy people, if they make it clear, well, I'm not going to owe any tax because I have all these net operating loss carry forwards. They're called NOLs in tax world. You're not going to collect anything anyway. If you're a tax auditor, because I've interviewed a lot of them, and you say, hey, look, this guy's cheating left and right, but he's in a negative position and he's going to be for another 5 or 6 years at least, they'll just close the audit because the IRS gets penalized by Congress when they do audits that don't bring in any money. You might have a pool of money, $1 billion, but it won't start coming in for 6 or 10 years. That's not how the system works. It's on an annualized basis. Now, if we go to my system where you can't get any money without it going through your trustee, we can shrink the IRS down tremendously because instead of ever auditing you, we don't have to audit you. We just have to audit your trustee. And if we require that these trustees be bonded, trained, licensed, and we put in place rules to make them behave. So long as you behave, you got a good business. If you were to conspire with one of your clients to move money out without paying the taxes, here's what you face. A 5% penalty if you pay the money within 30 days. Penalty of up to 200% if you don't pay it. And these numbers I'm giving you, by the way, come from other portions of the tax code. Those are the penalties for non-payment and continued recalcitrant non-payment. 200% to you. Oh, by the way, we get to collect from your client as well. So we, the government, can collect 6 times the amount of taxes you tried to evade. In addition, if you do this, the penalties range from a very serious fine up to you are barred forever from this business. Any aspect of it, owning any stock in it, you may have nothing to do with this kind of business for life and jail. And under my system, if I were to call up my trustee and say, listen, this is really stupid, but I got one of my students pregnant and I need to get $1 million out of the account to pay her off. You're going to say to me, shut up. One more word, and I'm required to file a public report that you're setting out to engage in a fraud. And the minute I hit the send button, it's public record. So not another word, and I'm not going to do it. Imagine the reverse scenario. I'm having an affair with my trustee's daughter or wife, and he wants to get me, so he phonies up a report that I proposed something. Well, he's subject to the same draconian penalties if you do that. He can lose his license, he can be forced to pay a bunch of money, he can go to prison. So there's an incentive to behave both from a virtue perspective and a viciousness perspective. Everything in my proposal for what I'm calling the prosperity tax, we'll see if it survives at the publishing house, is in existing law. There's nothing radical in what I'm proposing. It's all in existing law. And it would just simplify our tax. Our tax code itself in the official government version is almost 4,000 pages. I can do a tax code in under 200 pages because we're going to treat all money the same. A dollar is a dollar is a dollar. And we're going to eliminate all these filigree, these special rules. Oh, well, you bought this on that date, so no tax for you, or you get pay tax 20 years in the future, and you can invest the tax money. And so finally, here's how some individuals and many corporations appear to pay taxes, but actually are making a profit off the tax system. You owe $1 million tax this year. You find a lawful investment device that will allow you to defer paying those taxes for 30 years. Warren Buffett has one where after 34 years, only half of the money in the fund, which is 2/3 of $1 billion, will be subject to tax. So you invest this money for 30 years. Now, the earnings will be taxable. Nonetheless, at the end of 30 years, you still only owe $1 million, which inflation will have reduced to maybe $500,000 in real terms. You will pay your tax, and from the investment earnings, you'll end up with about $2 million if you're just a very modest investor. You'll be better off than if you'd paid the tax right away. And many, many companies do this. Their annual report says we paid this much in tax. Well, they did. But much of that was on taxes that they deferred for 5, 10, 15, 20. In Warren Buffett's case, maybe 50 years. So you're just seeing an accounting entry that has nothing to do with the real economic impact of that. So one of the things I hope that all of you think about going forward is that we should have a tax system that follows ancient principles. The more you make, the higher the share of your income or wealth you should be giving back to the government. Convenience of paying should be easy to pay. Predictability of paying, you should know what's going to happen to you. And then incentives to behave properly in the tax system. Incentives that will make it very troublesome for people who flout the law, which requires one more thing: law enforcement. We don't have enough tax police. We don't have enough tax police. We only prosecute about 1,800 tax cases a year federally. And that just means filing a case. We get about 500 convictions a year out of 160 million individual tax returns. And almost all of those 500 convictions are drug traffickers, mobsters, or other business people who paid bribes to officials or government officials who took the bribes, as with Senator Menendez in New Jersey, or drug dealers, people who gave bribes or people who took bribes. Just flat out cheating, nothing. Far fewer than 100 convictions a year, because they're hard to make under current law. So with that, questions? Who's got the microphone? There we go. So back here in the blue. And then the gentleman with the beard over here.
I just want to say that you're the only person who would have made me get up this morning and come to hear about
Oh, well,
taxes.
thank you.
So I'm like, the question is, have you thought about reading your book to the young people instead of just having a written copies?
Well, book publishing has just fallen apart. We sold in this country 2 million fewer books last year. 85% of American households, if you exclude the Bible, after high school, never buy a single book, not even, romance novels. 85% never buy a book. So I don't expect large numbers of people to buy it, but if I don't put it in book form, the people who are important in the world of tax, the professors, the economists, et cetera, they won't pay serious attention to it. I will tell you, I've had a bunch of people go over my system, and every one of them says the same thing. Yay, you did it. Some of them are like, newspaper reporter, you're going to define it. You're going to write a new tax code. But they all say this works. They all say it would make the country vastly wealthier. And they all say the people who are turning a profit off the tax system are going to spend billions of dollars vilifying you so the public never knows about it. And so it's a fool's errand. And I say, well, progress in America always comes from the bottom. We got child labor laws, even though there were ministers back a little over 100 years ago who were literally saying to their flocks, it is God's plan that these children work in the factories, and the people seeking these child labor laws are the agents of the devil. We still got child labor laws, We got suffrage for women. We did a lot of things, but they always come from the bottom up. So, sir.
I don't know if I'll understand your answer or whatever, but on the last slide, about the percentages of income,
Yes.
or percentages of tax, was that just income tax, or was that?
No, that's all state and local taxes in each state. So sales taxes, property taxes, income taxes. Alabama is a good example. The bottom fifth of Alabamans have an annual income of less than $15,000. And they pay a tax rate that's about 5 times that of the top 1% of Alabamans.
And then with your tax proposal, is that also talking about all dollars, or so there's not a difference between income tax, property tax?
No.
sales
We will
tax?
still have multiple kinds of taxes. And the reason is if you only taxed one thing, people will find ways around it. One of the things I've pointed out sometimes to audiences, this is civilization. Modern world is electricity. It is the defining difference between us and the ancient peoples. If you ever go to Pompeii, and be sure you walk down to Herculaneum because it's much more interesting down there, you'll see how people lived almost 2,000 years ago. and they didn't have electricity. So they lived sort of like they lived in a modern shopping mall, except it's outdoors. Without electricity, there's no refrigeration, elevators, jet airplanes, automobiles. Doesn't happen. So we could, because you can't escape electricity unless you really want to be a hermit living out in a hut in the woods, we could run our entire tax system off electricity. And there would be some double counting issues where, you know, there's a company that uses electricity to make a product that then other people use, but we could do that in theory. And we're not going to do that because I assure you pretty soon people would say, oh, well, I'm not going to be on the metered system. I'm going to put up my own solar panels at home. And then how would we tax them without a lot of administrative difficulty? So, ma'am, hold on, microphone right behind you.
Under your system, what kind of deductions would you have?
Well, I do not in my proposal give you tax rates because that's not a principle, that's a mechanical issue. You set the tax rates or how much money you want to raise. I believe in the ancient principle that income taxes should only apply to what was called 100 and some years ago when we adopted our income tax system, surplus income. Adam Smith said you shouldn't tax the necessaries of life. And he pointed out those vary from place to place. That, for example, in England, if you didn't own a linen shirt, you couldn't get a job in an office. But in France, and you were expected to wear shoes. But in France, lots of women didn't own a pair of shoes. They were barefoot all the time. Things differ from one society to another, but it would be Congress's job to set a level for taxes. And I would argue that economically right now, that's probably around $100,000 for a married couple. I also wouldn't give you a deduction for your children. I'm a father of 8 here. If we want to subsidize people's children, and as I believe very much we should, it's a very smart investment, that should be outside the tax code. You have a child, you get a check from the government every month for $300. You have 2 kids, you get $600. You have to set it low enough that, you know, only some idiots are going to have a bunch of kids to collect the money. But if we want to subsidize children, we should do it directly. We should take all these welfare things that are in the tax code, both corporate welfare and individual welfare, pull them out of the tax code and put them on the spending side where they're transparent. So, anybody else?
So how do you counter the argument, this is socialism?
Well, human beings are social animals. I mean, it's just as simple as that. I mean, we have a socialized fire department. We tried free market fire departments and, you know, whole city blocks burned down because it doesn't work. We have socialized police forces, so we don't have vigilantes. We have socialized district attorneys, Army, Navy, Marines, courts. All those things are socialized. Roads are socialized. You know, when people bring up that argument, you know, they are, to not be polite, idiots. So.
You'll have to be careful.
Yes. Actually, people that have private planes pay airports to use them, but they don't pay anywhere near the actual costs. And years ago, I exposed how Congress set up these rules that encourage executives to use corporate jets. They pay less per mile than a taxi cab. In fact, a small fraction of per mile of a taxi cab. And when I was exposing Jack Welch's retirement deal, all it said in the disclosure to the shareholders was, upon his retirement, Mr. Welch shall continue to enjoy all the emoluments of his office as chief executive. No other discussion. And the editors of the New York Times said, you can't write a story about that. Well, he decided to take up with a mistress, and a few weeks before his 10-year prenuptial agreement with his wife was to expire, she happens to be a very successful, nationally prominent litigator. So she sued him and put into the record what he was getting. Unlimited use of a Boeing 737 owned by GE. They owned a bunch of them. That had a shower in the air and a bathroom, a bedroom and other things. and memberships in golf country clubs and all sorts of things that I figured were worth over his lifetime around $70 million. No objection from GE to my calculations there, which tells you I was low. And I pointed out in just not a very long article in the New York Times, it's a column and a half in length, 900 words, that if, should Mr. Welch wake up and say, gee, I think I want to go have dinner in Paris and come right back, buying a last minute seat in the middle of a 5 across row on Air France from New York to Paris will cost you, I think it was $1,143. You just go to the airport and get a seat, and that's what you're going to get. Mr. Welch's cost under the terms of his retirement plan for the use of that jet, which Charter Services said would price out at $200,000, would be $943. That would be the net of his cost after the benefits from the company. And Welch immediately wrote a piece for the Wall Street Journal renouncing all of his retirement benefits. And he began it by saying, some people don't respect contracts. So in one of my future books, I wrote that, well, Welch must have been referring to me because it was my article that prompted him, but he never answered the question of whether he was talking about his contract of retirement or his contract of marriage to his former wife. And a journalist I know went to interview him once, and he exploded when my name came up. I mean, long strings of 4 and 7 letter words and his screaming at the top of his lungs. And the person who had no idea the piece, because they were out of the country, called me and said, you know, what went on between you two? I said, never met the man in my life, but he's entitled to be angry at me. I cost him $70 million. I outsmarted him. So anyway,
David?
somebody else. had
Oh,
hands.
we
Oh,
need,
way
I
back
think
here.
we need to,
We need to go.
yeah.
Okay.
And
I'll talk to you
and-
one-on-one.
And I would be tempted to ask you to comment on the economic argument